Before I tell you what was inside that envelope, let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Hit like and subscribe if you believe the dead can still protect the living. My daughter walked into my kitchen on a Tuesday morning with 3 flattened moving boxes tucked under her arm, set them down on the counter without asking, and told me I'd had enough years in this house. She said it the way you'd tell someone their coffee was getting cold. Simple. Final. Like she'd rehearsed it in the car. My name is Edward Callahan. I'm 68 years old, and for 41 of those years I worked the floor of a machine shop outside Dayton, Ohio, running lathes and mills until my hands learned to read metal better than they ever read a book. My wife Margaret and I bought this house in 1988 with a loan we paid off 11 years early, one extra payment at a time, because Margaret believed a paid-off roof was the only inheritance that mattered. She died 8 months ago. Pancreatic cancer, diagnosed in March, gone by June. Fast the way a fire is fast when the wind picks up. I'm not going to pretend I handled her death well. For the first few weeks I forgot to eat unless someone reminded me. I'd wake up and reach for her side of the bed before my mind caught up with my hands. Grief does that. It hollows you out quietly, and while you're hollow, people can pour almost anything into you, and you won't notice the weight until it's already settled. My daughter Rachel noticed the hollow space first. Rachel is 41. She married a man named Derek Voss 14 years ago, a real estate developer who talks the way glossy brochures read, all upside, no fine print. For most of their marriage, Derek did well enough. He flipped a few duplexes, built a strip mall out past the interstate, drove a truck that cost more than my first house. I never loved the man, but I kept my opinions in my back pocket because Rachel loved him, and because Margaret always said a father's job is to open the door, not guard it. After the funeral, Rachel started coming around more, Tuesdays for groceries, Thursdays to check on the house. At first I was grateful. I told myself God had sent me a daughter who understood that a father alone in a big quiet house needed company more than casseroles. She'd sit at my kitchen table, the same table Margaret used to lean on with her elbows while she paid bills, and she'd ask me how I was sleeping, whether the stairs were getting hard on my knees, whether I'd thought about options for the future. I should have paid closer attention to that word. Options. About 6 weeks after the funeral, Derek came by on a Saturday with a folder of papers. He said it was nothing serious, just a durable power of attorney, standard for a man my age, so that if anything ever happened to me, Rachel could step in and handle my bills, my medical decisions, keep the lights on without a judge getting involved. He said his own parents had signed 1 year ago, and it had saved the family a mountain of legal headaches. He had a pen already uncapped in his hand when he said it, the cap resting on the folder, like a period at the end of a sentence that hadn't been read yet. I signed it. God forgive me, I signed it without reading past the first page, because my wife had been in the ground for 6 weeks, and I was still forgetting which drawer held the spoons. Derek smiled, folded the papers back into a leather portfolio, and told me I'd done the responsible thing. He said it twice, the responsible thing, as if he needed to hear it as much as I did. Looking back now, I can see exactly what that signature was. It wasn't protection. It was a key cut in the dark, slipped into my hand while I was too tired to ask what door it opened. The small things started disappearing not long after. My truck went first. A 2009 Silverado, nothing fancy, but it started every morning and it was mine free and clear. Derek borrowed it in August to haul drywall for a renovation, said his own truck was in the shop. 2 weeks passed. When I finally asked about it, Rachel told me very gently that Derek had gone ahead and sold it, because the insurance on 2 vehicles registered to my name was a liability the estate didn't need to carry. I hadn't authorized a sale. I hadn't been asked. I'd been informed after the fact, in the same tone you'd use to tell someone the weather had changed, then it was the garden. Margaret spent 30 years building rose beds along the east side of the house. Bonica roses, a climbing Ziffarine Druheen. She trained up a trellis my own hands had built for her. In September, I came home from a doctor's appointment to find the beds torn out down to bare dirt. Rachel was standing in the yard with a real estate photographer, arranging a set of white porch chairs Derek had bought without telling me. She said the roses were overgrown and dated, that clean, modern curb appeal photographed better, that we needed the house to look market ready. I asked her, market ready for what? She said it was just in case, just a precaution. The same words Derek had used with the power of attorney. I was starting to notice the pattern in the language before I let myself notice the pattern in the theft. By October, my workshop tools were gone. 40 years of accumulated hand tools. A table saw Margaret bought me for our 30th anniversary. All of it sold at what Rachel called a garage sale to clear clutter, while I was at a cardiology follow-up 2 towns over. She'd left me $40 in an envelope on the workbench. Like a tip, I stood in that empty garage for a long time that evening, running my hand along the dust outline where the table saw used to sit, and for the first time since Margaret died, I felt something other than grief. I felt the cold, specific edge of being robbed by people who called it help. I want to be fair to Rachel, because fairness was something Margaret drilled into me for 40 years of marriage. And I'm not going to abandon it now just because it's convenient. I don't believe Rachel set out to hollow me out the way Derek did. I believe Derek's business had been bleeding money longer than anyone in that family let on. And I believe Rachel convinced herself that helping her husband survive a crisis and helping her father downsize into his golden years were the same act of love wearing 2 different faces. She wasn't lying to me so much as she was lying to herself first, and letting the lie spill over onto me because it was easier than looking straight at what her husband had become. That doesn't make what happened forgivable. It makes it explainable. There's a difference, and I've had a long time now to sit with both words. In late October, I got a call from my bank that changed the shape of everything. A young loan officer named Priya, kind enough to actually pick up the phone instead of mailing a form letter, called to confirm a scheduled payment on a home equity line of credit taken out against my house back in July. $42,000, drawn down almost entirely within the first month. I told her there had to be a mistake. I had never applied for a HELOC in my life. She read me the application date, the notary's name, and the signature on file. She offered to email me a copy. When the file came through that evening, I sat at my kitchen table, Margaret's table, and stared at a signature that was almost mine, almost. The E leaned a half degree too far right. The C in Callahan closed at the bottom, which mine never does. 41 years of signing time cards taught my hand a habit that doesn't lie. It was close enough to fool a bank teller, glancing at a stack of closing documents. It was not close enough to fool a man who has signed his own name every working day since 1978. I didn't call Rachel that night. I called Frank Delgado instead. Frank lives 3 doors down and spent 26 years with the Montgomery County Sheriff's Office before he retired, the last 8 of them working financial crimes against the elderly. Of all things. He and Margaret used to trade tomato seedlings every spring. He came over within the hour, sat across from me at that same table, and read the loan documents twice without saying a word. When he finally looked up, his face had the particular stillness I'd only ever seen on him once before, the night he told a neighbor her husband wasn't coming home from his shift. "Edward," he said, "I'm not going to tell you what to feel, but I am going to tell you what to do, and the first thing you're going to do is nothing. You're not going to confront anybody tonight. You're going to let me make a few calls, and you're going to think very carefully about anything Margaret might have left you that you haven't opened yet." I sat with that question for a long moment before it landed, because there was something. There had been something for 8 months sitting in the fireproof box in the back corner of what used to be my workshop, and I had not touched it because Margaret had made me promise I wouldn't. 3 days before she died, when the pain medication still let her have clear stretches in the morning, Margaret asked the hospice nurse to give us the room. She reached into the drawer of her nightstand. She'd had me bring it from home to the hospice house. Insisted on it, and I never asked why, and pulled out a cream-colored envelope, sealed with the little rose wax stamp her mother had given her decades ago, the one she used maybe twice a year for something she considered important enough to seal properly instead of just licking the flap. She pressed it into my hands with a grip that still had more strength in it than I expected from a woman that sick, and she made me promise 3 things. Don't open it unless Rachel or Derek ever try to take something that isn't theirs to take. Don't tell Rachel it exists unless that day comes. And don't be gentle when that day comes, Edward, because I already have been, for years, and gentle is what got us here. I hadn't understood that last part. I still don't fully understand what she knew, or when she started knowing it, but I understood, sitting there with Frank Delgado across my kitchen table, and a forged signature glowing on my laptop screen, that the day my wife had warned me about had finally arrived. I told Frank about the envelope. He didn't ask to see it. He said only that whatever was in it, I should retrieve it soon, somewhere private, and that I shouldn't mention its existence to Rachel or Derek under any circumstances until we knew what we were dealing with. He left a little after 10 that night with a promise to make a few quiet calls to a friend of his who still worked fraud cases, and I sat alone in my kitchen for a long time afterward, listening to the refrigerator hum and thinking about my wife's handwriting on the outside of that envelope, 5 words in blue fountain pen ink, for Edward. Only when necessary. I didn't sleep much that week. I kept the loan documents in a folder under my bed like a man hiding evidence in his own house, which I suppose is exactly what I was. Rachel called twice to schedule what she called a family conversation. I told her I was tired and we'd talk soon. It wasn't a lie. I was tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. The conversation came anyway, on its own schedule, the following Tuesday. I remember it was raining, a thin gray November rain that made the whole street look like it had been drained of color. I heard the car doors before I heard the knock. 2 doors, not 1, which meant Derek had come along, which meant this wasn't a casserole visit. Rachel came in first, and behind her Derek carried 3 flattened moving boxes tucked under one arm like he was delivering pizza. He set them on my kitchen counter without asking, the same counter where Margaret used to roll out pie dough every Thanksgiving. And Rachel pulled out a chair across from me and sat down with the particular composure of someone who has practiced a speech in a car mirror. "Dad," she said, "we need to talk about what's next." I asked her what she meant by next. She reached over and set a glossy folder on the table, and I recognized the logo on the cover before she even opened it. Meadowbrook Senior Living. A facility 40 minutes north with a monthly fee that would have made Margaret laugh out loud. Rachel opened it to a page with my name already typed into a welcome letter, a move-in date already penciled beside it, 2 weeks out. She told me Derek had already spoken with a realtor about listing the house, that they had, in fact, already received an offer, that the market was strong right now, and it would be foolish to wait. And then she said the sentence that Frank Delgado had, without knowing it, spent a week preparing me to hear without flinching. "You've had enough years in this house, Dad. It's time you let it go, and let us take care of you." I looked at my daughter across that table for what felt like a very long time. I thought about the way Margaret used to say my name when she was about to disagree with me, not angry, just certain, the way a woman is certain when she's already thought a thing through 3 times before saying it once out loud. I thought about a cream-colored envelope sealed with a rose stamp, sitting in a fireproof box less than 40 feet from where I was sitting, untouched for 231 days. I did not raise my voice. I did not throw the folder back across the table. I have found, in 68 years on this earth, that the men who need to shout are usually the ones who have nothing else. I had something else, and I hadn't even opened it yet. I stood up slowly, told Rachel and Derek I needed a moment, and walked out through the kitchen door, into the rain toward the garage, past the bare dirt where Margaret's roses used to climb. My workshop was empty now, except for a workbench nobody had thought to sell, and bolted underneath it, hidden behind a panel Margaret herself had asked me to install 15 years ago for reasons I'd never questioned, was a small fireproof box. I knelt down on the concrete floor in the November cold, worked the panel loose with fingers that weren't quite steady, and pulled the box into my lap. Inside, resting exactly where I'd placed it 8 months ago, was the envelope, cream-colored, sealed with a rose stamped in dark red wax. 5 words in my wife's blue fountain pen ink, for Edward. Only when necessary. I sat there on the cold concrete floor of my empty workshop, rain drumming on the tin roof above me. my daughter and her husband waiting inside my own kitchen, with a moving date already circled on a calendar. And I broke the seal my wife had pressed into that wax with her own thumb 8 months before she died. The letter inside was 4 pages long, written in Margaret's small, careful hand, the same handwriting that used to fill 3x5 recipe cards and grocery lists left on this exact counter for 37 years. I read it twice before I could make myself stand up off that cold concrete floor. She wrote that she had known for almost 6 years, not suspected, known. Back when Rachel and Derek first married, Derek had come to Margaret alone, while I was at a union meeting, and asked whether we'd consider co-signing a construction loan for his first strip mall project. Margaret had asked to see his financials before agreeing to anything, the way her own father, a bank examiner, had taught her to read numbers instead of promises. What she found in those pages wasn't a business plan. It was a man already 3 properties underwater, already juggling 2 other loans against assets that didn't fully belong to him, already, in Margaret's words, borrowing his way toward a cliff and calling it momentum. She told him no. She never told me because Derek begged her not to embarrass him in front of his father-in-law, and because at the time it seemed like a private failure rather than a pattern, but Margaret didn't forget. That was the thing about my wife that people who only knew her casserole and church social side never understood. She forgot nothing, and she forgave slowly, and she prepared for things quietly, the same way she'd quietly built a rose garden, one cutting at a time over 30 years, without ever once telling me the finished picture in advance. 6 years ago, without a word to me, Margaret had gone to see an old college friend of hers, a woman named Grace Whitfield, who'd become an estate attorney in Columbus. Together they had restructured the deed to our house into an irrevocable trust. Not in Rachel's name, not in mine alone, but held jointly with Margaret as the primary trustee until her death, at which point trusteeship would pass not to Rachel, but to Grace Whitfield herself, acting on my behalf, with instructions that the property could not be sold, mortgaged, or transferred without the trustee's written consent, and a minimum 90-day waiting period with independent legal review. Margaret's letter explained she'd done it the same month she'd said no to Derek's loan request. Because, in her words, a woman doesn't have to believe the worst about her son-in-law to build a fence around what she loves. She just has to have seen one crack in the foundation and remember where it was. Which meant that whatever offer Derek had already lined up on my house, whatever moving date Rachel had already penciled into a Meadowbrook welcome packet, none of it could legally happen. Not without going through Grace Whitfield first. Not without a 90-day window that would give any fraud time to surface. My wife, 8 months in the ground, had built a wall around our home before either of them ever thought to try climbing it. But that wasn't the part of the letter that made my hands shake. The 4th page held something else. Copies, not originals, but clear enough, of financial statements Margaret had quietly gathered over the past 2 years, through Grace's office, pulling public liens in court, filings the way a woman pulls weeds, a little at a time, without ever making a show of it. Derek's strip mall had defaulted 18 months ago. 2 of his investors had already filed civil suits, alleging he'd misrepresented the project's financing to secure their capital. And tucked behind those pages was something Margaret herself hadn't lived to see, something Grace must have added more recently, and mailed to the house in a second, smaller envelope Margaret had instructed me, in a handwritten note clipped to the front, to open only after the first. A preliminary finding from a forensic document examiner Grace had quietly retained months ago at Margaret's earlier direction to keep watch on any activity against our property records. The examiner's letter, dated 3 weeks prior, stated that a HELOC application filed against our home in July bore a signature inconsistent with verified exemplars on file and recommended immediate referral to the Counter-Prosecutor's Economic Crimes Unit if the account holder wished to pursue it. My wife had died not knowing Derek would forge my name. But she had died knowing exactly what kind of man might try, and she had built the machinery to catch him 6 years before he ever picked up the pen. I knelt there in that cold workshop for a long time with the rain still drumming overhead, And for the first time since June, I cried. Not the grief I'd been carrying for 8 months, but something else entirely. Something closer to gratitude, so sharp it hurt. Margaret hadn't just left me a house. She'd left me a trap, built with patience, funded with love, and set to spring exactly when I would need it most. I dried my face, folded the letter back into the envelope, and walked back into the kitchen with the rain still on my shoulders. Rachel and Derek were exactly where I'd left them, the Meadowbrook folder still open on the table, Derek checking something on his phone with the particular restlessness of a man waiting for a verdict he's already decided in his own favor. I sat back down across from them, and I did not slide the envelope across the table. Not yet. Frank Delgado's advice was still ringing in my ears. Don't confront tonight. Let the machinery work. And grief may have made me foolish for a season, but it had not made me stupid forever. I'll think about Meadowbrook, I told them, and I watched something in Derek's shoulders relax. The particular ease of a predator who believes the trap has already sprung shut in his favor. Give me a week. I want to see the offer on the house in writing before anybody signs anything. Derek said that was smart, that he'd have the paperwork to me by Friday, that he was proud of me for being reasonable about this. I remember that word landing on me like a slap wrapped in a compliment. Reasonable. As if reason were something only I had been lacking. They left a little after 7. I stood at the window and watched their taillights disappear down the wet street, and then I called Frank. He came over within 20 minutes, and this time, I handed him the envelope without hesitation. He read Margaret's letter standing up at my counter, and when he got to the part about the forensic document examiner, he let out a low whistle I'd never heard him make in 6 years of trading tomato seedlings across the fence. Your wife, he said, was smarter than every crooked contractor I chased in 26 years combined. Over the next several days, Frank and I built what he called, only half joking, a war room out of my kitchen table. He put me in touch with his old colleague, a detective named Renata Cho, who still worked economic crimes for the county, and Grace Whitfield flew in from Columbus for a single afternoon to sit across from me with a legal pad and walk through exactly what the trust protected, and exactly what it didn't. She confirmed what Margaret's letter had promised. The house could not be sold without her written release, and any attempt to force the issue would trigger a mandatory judicial review. She also told me something that turned my stomach in a new direction entirely. The HELOC Derek had forged wasn't the only debt sitting quietly against assets that weren't his to pledge. Grace had found a second lien, filed only 6 weeks earlier, against a small parcel of land, half an acre behind the house that Margaret and I had bought in 1994 for a garden expansion we never got around to building. Land that had somehow ended up listed as collateral on a business loan Derek had taken out in his own name, using a copy of a deed with my signature notarized by someone who, according to Renata Cho's early digging, did not appear to hold an active notary commission in the state of Ohio. Derek wasn't just desperate. He was drowning fast enough that he'd started forging his way across every piece of paper he could reach, hoping the tide would turn before anyone noticed the water rising. I want to tell you that hearing all this made me angry in the way you'd expect, the kind of anger that wants to slam a door or raise a fist. It didn't, not exactly. What I felt instead was closer to the stillness Margaret used to have, right before she made a decision she'd already turned over in her mind 100 times. I understood, sitting in Grace Whitfield's careful legal language, that shouting at Derek across my kitchen table would accomplish nothing except warning him to run. What he needed, what Margaret had clearly always intended, was to be caught in the open, in front of the very people whose approval he'd spent his whole life chasing, with no room left to talk his way sideways out of it. There was one more piece of this I hadn't accounted for, and it arrived on my doorstep the following Sunday in the form of my grandson. Caleb is 19, Rachel and Derek's only child, currently in his 2nd year at Ohio State studying finance, of all things, which I've always privately suspected was less a career choice and more an attempt to understand the parents who raised him. I hadn't seen much of him since Margaret's funeral. College has a way of swallowing a young man whole, but he showed up unannounced that Sunday afternoon, still in the hoodie he'd probably worn on the 3-hour drive down, looking like he hadn't slept properly in a week. He sat at the kitchen table, the same table that had by now hosted more quiet reckonings than I could count, and he told me he'd overheard his parents arguing 2 nights before. Not about me, not directly, about money. About a man named Whitcomb, one of the investors suing Derek, who had apparently called the house, threatening to go to the state licensing board if Derek didn't produce $40,000 by the end of the month. Caleb said his mother had been crying in the kitchen, and his father had said something that stuck with him enough to drive 3 hours south to repeat it to me word for word. He said, "Your grandfather's house is worth 6 times what we owe. The old man's not going to need all that space once he's settled. This solves everything." I sat very still when Caleb told me that, not because it surprised me. By then, very little about Derek could, but because I watched my grandson's face while he said it, and I saw something in it I recognized from a much older mirror. The particular look of a young man realizing the ground he'd been standing on his whole life had never been solid at all. "Grandpa," he said, "is it true? Are they trying to sell your house?" I didn't lie to him. I told him everything: the forged HELOC, the fabricated deed on the garden parcel, the trust his grandmother had quietly built 6 years earlier without a word to any of us, the letter I'd read on my knees in a cold workshop with rain coming through the tin roof. Caleb listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening a little more with every sentence. And when I finished, he was quiet for a long moment before he asked me the only question that mattered. "What do you need me to do?" I want to be honest about something here, because Margaret taught me that honesty is worth more than a tidy story. I did not immediately trust that question. I had watched his parents manipulate grief into signatures and kindness into theft for 8 months, and some hard, tired part of me wondered whether Caleb had been sent, whether this was simply a softer approach to the same old goal. But I looked at his eyes, red-rimmed and furious in a way that had nothing performed about it, and I remembered that this was the same boy who used to sit on my workshop floor as a child, handing me wrenches before I asked for them, who cried harder at Margaret's funeral than either of his parents did. I decided to trust him, the way you decide to trust a bridge, carefully, one step at a time, weight testing it as you go. I told him that if he wanted to help, the first thing he could do was nothing dramatic. Just watch. Just listen. His father had already shown him. He talks too freely when he thinks no one but family is in the room, and family, it turned out, still included a 19-year-old boy. Nobody in that house had thought to be careful around. Over the following 2 weeks, a quiet second front opened in this war, one Derek and Rachel never saw coming. Frank Delgado and Detective Cho built their case slowly and carefully, cross-referencing the forged notary stamp with 3 other suspicious filings across the county. It turned out Derek had used the same fraudulent notary contact on at least 2 other properties tied to his failing business, which meant Renata Cho's Economic Crimes Unit was suddenly looking at something considerably larger than one angry father-in-law's complaint. Grace Whitfield formally filed the trust's objection to any sale or transfer of the house, which, once Derek's realtor received it, apparently caused a very uncomfortable phone call I wasn't present for, but heard about secondhand from Rachel, who called me sounding rattled for the first time in months, asking whether I knew anything about some paperwork Mom apparently filed years ago. I told her truthfully that I'd only just learned of it myself, and left it at that. Meanwhile, Caleb drove down every weekend he could manage, sat quietly through family dinners, and reported back small details that individually meant little, but together a painted picture of a man circling the drain and grabbing at anything within reach. A second undisclosed loan Derek was pursuing against equipment that belonged to his business partner, a growing stack of unopened certified mail Caleb had spotted on the kitchen counter, his mother's increasingly hollow reassurances that everything would be fine once Dad's deal with Grandpa went through. The deal Rachel meant, of course, was Meadowbrook, the house sale. The 2 weeks I'd asked for to think about it, which both of them had apparently interpreted as a countdown to my surrender rather than what it actually was. the exact amount of time Grace Whitfield needed to finish building an airtight legal case, and the exact amount of time Detective Cho needed to secure a forensic handwriting comparison that would hold up in court. On the Thursday before that 2-week deadline was set to expire, Derek called me directly for the first time in months. His voice had a brightness to it. I recognized immediately the same manufactured cheer Rachel used to talk about curb appeal while standing in the wreckage of her mother's rose garden. He told me he'd arranged something special, a small gathering, that Saturday, not at my house, but at the community center where his company was hosting what he called an investor appreciation event, a chance to showcase his upcoming projects and reassure his backers that the business was, in his words, turning a corner. He wanted me there. He said it would mean a great deal to Rachel to see her father supporting the family during a difficult stretch. He said, almost as an afterthought, that he'd also invited a realtor to walk me through the offer paperwork on the house that same afternoon so we could wrap things up cleanly before the Meadowbrook move-in date. I sat holding the phone for a long moment after he finished talking, looking out my kitchen window at the bare dirt where Margaret's roses used to climb, and I understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful, that Derek had just handed me exactly the stage Margaret's letter had always intended me to stand on. I told him I'd be there. I told him I was looking forward to it. Then I hung up the phone and I called Frank and Grace and Detective Cho, one after another, and told each of them the same thing Saturday. It's happening Saturday. The community center sat on the edge of a shopping plaza off Route 4, the kind of beige, low building that hosts wedding receptions and blood drives in equal measure, and by 2 o'clock that Saturday, its parking lot was fuller than I'd expected. Derek had rented the main hall and filled it with the trappings of a man trying to look larger than his circumstances, a banner reading Voss Development. Building Tomorrow stretched above a table of rendering boards showing glossy artist impressions of a retail complex that, according to Grace Whitfield's earlier research, existed mostly on paper and increasingly overdue permits. There were maybe 40 people scattered through the room, investors in golf shirts, a couple of contractors I recognized from around town, a young woman from the local business journal with a notepad she wasn't bothering to hide. I wore a gray suit that morning, the same one I'd worn to Margaret's funeral, because it seemed right, somehow, that the last suit I'd put on for her should also be the one I wore to finish what she'd started. In my breast pocket, I carried a folded copy of the forensic examiner's letter. In my jacket pocket, a small flash drive Grace had prepared, containing the full trust documentation, the forged HELOC comparison, and the fraudulent notary filings Detective Cho's office had by then connected across 4 separate properties. Rachel found me near the entrance, looking relieved in a way that made my chest ache a little. The particular relief of a daughter who believes her father has finally come around. She squeezed my arm and told me she was glad I'd come, that this meant more to Derek than I probably realized. I told her, honestly, that I understood exactly how much it meant to him. She didn't catch the edge in it. I don't think she was listening for one. Derek worked the room the way he always had, a hand on every shoulder, a laugh half a second too loud, steering investors toward the rendering boards with the ease of a man who'd been selling futures that didn't exist for years and had simply never been caught. A realtor I didn't recognize hovered near a side table with a folder that I knew, without being told, held the offer paperwork on my house. At 3 o'clock, Derek stepped up to a small podium near the rendering boards and tapped the microphone. He thanked everyone for coming, spoke for a few minutes about resilience and vision and weathering a difficult market, the same vocabulary he'd used on me in my own kitchen weeks earlier, and then he did something I hadn't fully anticipated, though in hindsight I should have. He gestured toward me, standing near the back of the room, and asked me to come up and say a few words as the family patriarch. His phrase, offered with a smile that had clearly been rehearsed as the emotional centerpiece of his little performance, the grieving father-in-law, publicly endorsing the son who was, in that same breath, planning to sell the roof over his head to cover a fraud investigation. I want you to understand something about that moment, because I've thought about it a great deal since. I could have simply declined. I could have shaken my head and let him finish his show and dealt with everything privately, through lawyers, through paperwork, the quiet, civilized way. Grace Whitfield had, in fact, drawn up all the private paperwork weeks in advance for exactly that option. But Margaret's letter had asked for something else. Don't be gentle when that day comes, Edward, because gentle is what got us here. My wife had spent 37 years being gentle with people who mistook her patience for permission, and in her final act on this earth, she had asked me to be something different just once, when it mattered most. I walked to the front of that room. I didn't raise my voice at first. I thanked Derek for the invitation, the way you'd thank a man for holding a door, and I looked out over 40 faces that had no idea what they were about to witness. I told them I'd like to say a few words about resilience, too, since Derek had raised the subject, but that my resilience had a different origin story than the one he'd just described. I told them about a fireproof box hidden under a workbench, about a letter written in blue fountain pen ink by a woman who'd known, 6 years before her death, that her son-in-law's business was built on borrowed ground that kept shifting. I told them about a rose garden torn out of the earth in September, about a truck sold without my knowledge in August, about tools disappearing from a garage, while I sat in a cardiologist's waiting room. I watched the smiles in that room start to falter, one at a time, the way a wave of dominoes falls when nobody's quite sure yet which one tipped first. I pulled the forensic examiner's letter from my breast pocket and read the relevant paragraph aloud, slowly the way Frank had coached me to, clearly, without embellishment, letting the plain language of fraud do its own work rather than dressing it up in my own anger. A signature inconsistent with verified exemplars. I told them about a second forged deed on a garden parcel Margaret and I had bought 30 years ago, used as collateral on a loan that had nothing to do with a rose garden and everything to do with keeping Derek's failing empire propped up one fraudulent document at a time. Derek's face, I remember, went through 3 distinct colors in under a minute. First, a flush of confused red, the look of a man convinced this must be some misunderstanding he could talk his way around. Then a gray, sickly pallor as he understood I wasn't confused, that I had documents, that I had names, that Detective Renata Cho of the Montgomery County Economic Crimes Unit, who had by prior arrangement been standing quietly near the back exit in plain clothes the entire time, along with 2 uniformed officers waiting outside as a formality Grace had insisted on for the sake of an orderly, non-dramatic arrest, was already stepping forward. He didn't run. To his credit, or perhaps simply because there was nowhere left to run, Derek stood frozen at his own podium while Detective Cho approached and, quietly, without theater, informed him he was being taken in for questioning regarding multiple counts of forgery, fraud, and identity theft connected to loan applications across at least 4 properties in the county. The room had gone completely, utterly silent, except for the soft click of the young journalist's phone camera and the shuffle of investors backing away from a man they'd been shaking hands with 20 minutes earlier. The same instinctive recoil I imagine happens whenever people realize they've been standing too close to something rotting. I want to tell you the private climax mattered more to me than the public one, because it did, and I think Margaret would have understood that instinct better than anyone. Rachel had been standing near the front row throughout my remarks, and I watched her face collapse in stages as I spoke. First disbelief, then a kind of frantic mental arithmetic I recognized from Caleb's description of her crying in the kitchen weeks earlier, and finally, when Detective Cho took Derek gently but firmly by the arm, something that looked less like shock and more like a dam breaking after years of quietly holding back water. She'd never let herself examine too closely. She didn't defend him. That surprised me more than almost anything else that day. She stood very still, both hands pressed over her mouth, and when the officers walked Derek out through the side door, past the Voss Development banner he'd hung with such confidence that morning, Rachel didn't follow him. She turned instead and looked at me across that suddenly empty stretch of community center floor, and the expression on her face was one I hadn't seen since she was 9 years old, and had broken Margaret's favorite serving dish, and had to walk into the kitchen and confess it. We didn't talk in that room. There were too many eyes. Too many people still processing what they just watched, and Frank Delgado, ever practical, quietly steered me toward a side exit before the local business journal reporter could catch up with questions I wasn't ready to answer in public. But 2 days later, Rachel came to my house alone, without Derek, without a folder, without a moving box in sight, and she sat down at my kitchen table and cried in a way I hadn't seen from her since her mother's funeral. She told me she hadn't known about the forged HELOC, that she believed him, genuinely believed him, when he'd told her it was a legitimate consolidation loan he'd need my signature on eventually, but hadn't wanted to bother me with while I was grieving. She told me she'd known, on some level, she'd refused to look it directly, that his business was struggling worse than he admitted, but that she'd let herself believe the Meadowbrook plan was really about caring for me, because believing that was easier than believing her husband was capable of forging her own father's signature to save himself. She told me about nights she'd lain awake, wondering why the numbers in their joint accounts never quite matched what Derek told her, and how she'd chosen, each time, to ask a smaller, safer question instead of the real one. I didn't forgive her that afternoon. I want to be honest about that, because false, easy forgiveness would have insulted everything Margaret had spent 6 years quietly building to protect me. I told Rachel that trust, like the trust her mother had constructed around this house, isn't something you're handed back all at once. It's something you rebuild one verified payment at a time, the way Margaret and I paid off this mortgage 11 years early, one extra installment after another, until the debt simply had nowhere left to hide. What I offered her instead was a path, not a pardon. I told her that if she wanted back into this family in any real way, it would start with actual, sustained, unglamorous work. Not an apology delivered once and considered settled, but a pattern repeated over months, the kind of pattern her mother had spent decades teaching me to recognize as the only proof that matters. Grace Whitfield helped her retain her own attorney, separate from anything tied to Derek's mounting legal troubles. And over the following weeks, Rachel cooperated fully with Detective Cho's investigation, providing bank records and messages that ultimately helped establish the timeline of exactly when Derek's forgeries began and how deliberately he'd hidden them from her. Derek, in the end, was charged with 11 counts spanning forgery, fraud, and practicing unlicensed notarization across 4 separate properties, including mine. 2 of his business partners, the ones who'd already filed civil suits, testified that he'd forged their signatures on refinancing documents as well once investigators started pulling that thread. He took a plea agreement rather than risk trial and was sentenced to 7 years, with restitution ordered to every victim identified, including a modest but symbolically important sum returned to the trust protecting my house. Rachel wasn't charged. Detective Cho's investigation found no evidence she'd known about the forgeries themselves, though the HELOC funds had, admittedly, helped cover household expenses she should perhaps have questioned more carefully. The county attorney's office, weighing what Grace Whitfield diplomatically called the difference between willful blindness and criminal intent, declined to pursue anything against her. I've made my own peace with that outcome. Margaret's letter never asked me to destroy my daughter. It asked me to stop being gentle with the people harming me, and there's a difference, I've come to understand, between refusing to be a victim and refusing to be a father. Caleb withdrew from Ohio State for a single semester, not out of academic trouble, but because, in his own words, he needed to be near me while everything settled, and because he'd started, quietly, working weekends at a small machine shop 2 towns over, learning the trade his grandfather had spent 41 years mastering, the same trade Derek had always dismissed, in Rachel's telling, as beneath the family's ambitions. He moved back into the dorms that spring, but he still drives down most Sundays, and most Sundays now involve the 2 of us out in what used to be my garage, replacing the tools that were sold out from under me, one careful purchase at a time, a used table saw here, a set of chisels there, funded not by any settlement or restitution check, but by an honest paycheck Caleb insists on contributing whether I ask him to or not. Rachel visits every other week now, always alone, always for a few hours rather than a quick drop-in, and the visits have taken on a particular shape over these past several months that I've come to trust more than any single conversation could earn on its own. She spent an entire Saturday in early spring on her knees in the dirt along the east side of my house, replanting Bonica roses she'd researched and special ordered herself, working alongside a nursery catalog and a stack of old photographs Margaret had kept of the original beds, trying, bed by bed, to rebuild something close to what she'd once helped tear out. She didn't ask me to watch. I watched anyway. From the kitchen window, the same window I'd stood at 8 months earlier, watching taillights disappear down a rainy street. And I understood that this, more than any apology spoken across my kitchen table, was the kind of proof Margaret had always believed in. Repeated action, not a single grand gesture, but a pattern, sustained over time, the only currency my wife ever fully trusted. The house itself remains exactly what Margaret built it to be, mine, protected, held in trust with Grace Whitfield's steady oversight until the day I decide, entirely on my own terms, what happens to it next. I've had 3 separate offers on the property since word of Derek's arrest got around town. Curious neighbors and one particularly persistent developer, hoping to pick up a paid-off house at a discount from a widower everyone assumed would want to sell and move somewhere smaller and quieter. I've turned down every one of them. I'm not going anywhere. Not because I'm stubborn about an old house with creaky stairs, though I probably am that too, but because every board and beam of this place carries 37 years of a marriage that outlasted its own ending. A woman who loved me carefully enough to protect me from a threat neither of us could name yet. 6 full years before it ever knocked on our door. I keep Margaret's letter now not in a fireproof box hidden under a workbench, but in a simple frame on the wall of what used to be my workshop, right above the spot where the new table saw sits, so that every time I walk in there to work with my hands the way I have my whole life, I see her handwriting first. For Edward. Only when necessary, I think about how patient she was, how she carried a secret that size for 6 years without ever once letting it sour her toward Derek, without ever once making our family dinners feel like she was watching him for a slip. She simply built her fence, quietly, and waited, and trusted that if the day ever came when I needed it, I would find the strength to walk through the fire she'd already prepared me to survive. Caleb asked me once, out in the garage on a quiet Sunday afternoon with sawdust settling in the light between us, why his grandmother never told anyone what she'd found, why she carried that suspicion alone for 6 years, instead of confronting Derek the moment she first saw those numbers. I thought about it for a long while before I answered, because it deserved a real answer, not a quick one. I told him that some people protect the ones they love by fighting loudly in the moment, and some people protect them by preparing quietly for a moment that hasn't come yet, and that the second kind of love is harder to see while it's happening, because it looks from the outside like nothing at all. It looks like silence. It looks like a woman filing paperwork alone in an attorney's office in Columbus, telling no one, asking for nothing in return, simply because she loved her family enough to imagine the worst of it and build something strong enough to survive that worst. Long before the rest of us even knew there was anything to survive. That, Caleb, I told him, is what your grandmother left behind. Not a house, not money. A fence built out of patience, standing exactly where it needed to stand, the day it was finally needed. He didn't say anything back. He just nodded, the way a 19-year-old nods when he's actually listening, and went back to sanding the edge of a birdhouse he was building for the new rose beds, so the wrens would have somewhere to nest come spring. I sit out on that porch most evenings now, in the same chair I used to share with Margaret, watching the roses climb a little higher every week along a trellis my own hands rebuilt. I don't carry the anger I expected to carry after everything that happened. What I carry instead is something closer to what my wife carried for 6 quiet years. The understanding that love isn't only the loud, easy kind that shows up in casseroles and Tuesday visits. Sometimes love is a fence, built in silence, waiting patiently for the one day it's needed most, and asking for nothing in return except that you have the courage, when that day finally comes, to walk through the fire it was built to survive. If you believe that quiet preparation is its own kind of love, and that a fence built in silence can protect you long after the person who built it is gone, share your thoughts in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe for more stories.